Today we're talking about something that sounds like it could be the plot of a spy thriller, but it's really just another day in the telecom policy. You might heard about the so-called rip and replace plan, which basically means the US government wants smaller telecom providers to yank out any gear made by certain Chinese companies and swap it with, well, anything that doesn't cause national security nightmares. And if you're wondering, yes, it's every bit as messy as it sounds. First off, let's talk about what rip and replace actually is. Picture this, you got a small town internet company that spent years building networks on affordable equipment from companies like Huawei and ZTE. The price was right and the hardware generally did the job. But then US officials came along and said, hey, we think there might be security risks hiding in that gear, so we need you to pull it out and replace it with something that's not under the influence of the Chinese government. Sounds straightforward in theory, but once you start crunching numbers and factoring in who pays for that new gear, it becomes less of a quick fix and more of a financial stadium. According to the government, this whole attempt is aimed at protecting critical infrastructure from potential spying or sabotage. The worry is that if a piece of your network is compromised, outside actors could tap into phone calls, text messages, or even shut down services. So, in a world filled with daily cyber attacks and data breaches, you can see why national security officials wouldn't want to take any chances. But here's the snag, a lot of these smaller carriers can't exactly wave a magic wand and ask up billions of dollars. They were assured the government would help pay for the job, but from what we're hearing, the money just isn't matching the real life cost estimates. Big shocker, right? So what's the final price tag? Some estimates say it costs billions more than originally planned. The smaller telecoms have been lining up to say, we need way more cash if you actually want us to do this without going bankrupt. Meanwhile, country customers who rely on the small operators for cell signals and internet don't want to see their services jacked up in price. It's like telling your neighborhood dinner, tear out his entire kitchen overnight and replace everything with top of the line equipment, or else then telling them the federal government will repay them later, but maybe only for the half of the cost. Good luck staying in the business. Speaking of deadlines, that's another loop. The carriers can just flip a switch and remove equipment that's spread out over vast areas. Think about the logistics. You get to send workers to different towers, install new hardware, test everything, and do it without taking the network down for days. Customers still need to make 911 calls, do their online classes, or stream their favorite shows. If the government's timeline is too strict, carriers might find themselves in hot water for not meeting the mandated dates. On the flip side, if the government's too lenient, they'll get criticized for leaving networks at risk for too long. Meanwhile, the tension between the US and China isn't exactly a new story. We've seen rising friction on everything from trade to technology experts. For policymakers, ripping out Chinese made equipment sends a clear message that they don't trust Beijing reaching to America's digital infrastructure. For China, it looks like a deliberate move to just stifle Chinese tech companies and push Western alternatives. Somewhere in the middle area, everyday folks who just want a stable internet connection and maybe a few bars of signal when they're out on a remote highway. Then there is the supply chain headache. Even if the carriers suddenly receive a blank check to replace this hardware, where do they get it from and how soon they can get it installed? We've seen major supply chain disputes in recent years, so replacing 10,000 upon thousands of network components isn't something you can do overnight. If the carriers can't meet the deadlines because they're waiting on shipments of new radios or antennas, you can bet that they'll lead another round of finger pointing between companies and regulators. Now, the Washington Post highlighted a big piece of this puzzle, the gap between what's promised in repayments and what's actually needed. The government might say, we've allocated a few billions of dollars for this project, but once the carriers submit the real world invoices, that pool of money starts to look pretty shallow. Imagine renovating your entire house and budgeting $10,000 for the job, only to discover that the real cost is closer to 30,000. That's basically what's happening on a national scale. The carriers don't want to front the difference if the government's not going to pay it back, and the government doesn't want to keep writing blank checks. It's a classic standoff with the actual customers caught in the crossfire. From a security perspective, critics argue that by the time all this gear is replaced, the global tech scene might have shifted, and we might be worried about some new threat. Others say it's not a question of if we should replace the equipment, but how fast can we actually get it done without crippling small businesses. In the end, it's a balancing act. Do we prioritize speed to remove potential security holes, or do we step carefully to avoid bankrupting local providers? One thing is certain, if these smaller carriers collapse under financial strain, rural communities will be the only one left without decent internet or cell service. That's a big deal if you live in an area where your only options are a tiny telecom co-op or satellite service that costs an arm and a leg. The last thing anyone wants is for a large portion of the country to become a digital dead zone over a policy debate. All in all, the Rip and Replace plan is shaping up to be a massive tug of war between governments, regulators, small telecoms, and the general concern of national security. It's a high-stake game that mixes economic realities with geopolitical competition. If you ask me, it's the perfect example how decisions made in Washington have a ripple effect across dusty highways and farmland cell towers. While the government cites legitimate security reasons, and the carrier city equally legitimate functional obstacles, the question remains who's going to bend first to make sure America stays both connected and protected. Anyway, that's the rundown on this ongoing saga. As usual, when government mandates meet real-world budgets, chaos follows. Let me know what you think. Should these carriers be forced to rip out everything as quickly as possible, or should the government slow down and find more money so they don't leave rural customers in the lurch? Either way, it's a drama that's still unfolding. Thanks for tuning in, and if you learned something new or just enjoyed hearing about this policy rollercoaster, be sure to leave a comment below. Stay informed, stay connected, and I'll see you in the next video.